Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good wherever you are. Welcome to a special Mirage Talk. Before I introduce our speaker for today, a few housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself on mute while the presentation is going. If you have a question, you can either open your mic and ask, or send it to the chat of the group. A reminder that this coming Monday, we have a Mirage Talk with the Walt Disney Company data scientist about artificial intelligence. So it should be an interesting one if you haven't registered. Without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. We have Professor Benny Miller from the University of Haifa, who will give us an overview of Ukraine, Russia, and what's happening behind the scenes. So Benny, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Eli. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and thanks for the audience for joining us in a very late night hour in Israel, not necessarily so on the East Coast, and definitely not on the Pacific Coast. My talk will address the sources and the effect of the Russia-Ukraine war. Obviously, that's a major humanitarian disaster, and I think all our sympathy goes with the Ukrainian people. However, I wouldn't so much focus on the humanitarian crisis as such, even though it's definitely major part of the war and its consequences. What I would try to understand is, first of all, the first puzzle will be why an interstate war is still possible in the 21st century, despite all the huge progress that humanity has done in the recent decades. Why a war, and this kind of a war? Because many analysts actually argue that we are actually already in an era of peace. And if there is war, first of all, it will be a civil war. And secondly, it will be in the Western world. It will be somewhere in Africa, Middle East, all these peripheral regions, but not in a major interstate war in Europe. So that will be my first PowerPoint. The second PowerPoint applies the general conditions for the war into the case of Putin and Russia. And what are the supposed motivation of Putin for going into the crisis first and then to the war. And so that will be the second PowerPoint. And the third PowerPoint will address the potential consequences and effects of the war. Obviously, we don't know yet. We're in the middle of things and nobody can know for sure. But what I will try to do is kind of to portray two potential kind of world orders coming out of the war. One will be more kind of an older power politics type of war that especially Soviet Union and then Russia were engaged in quite a few cases that we'll mention. But the second scenario, based on the evidence that we got so far, and obviously it's not the whole evidence, and what's going on in the Ukraine war, we might project a more optimistic, at least a relatively more optimistic scenario about the future world order coming out of this war, again, based on the evidence that we got from this war. So we'll try to kind of contrast these two potential world orders and the evidence that we have thus far in favor of each one of them. Let's start with the first PowerPoint and the question of why an interstate war erupts already in the third decade of the 21st century. So we have a number of reasons for that. Let me, one is the basic issue of the structure of the international system. Despite all the, again, the huge progress and many fascinating developments, definitely in the Silicon Valley and in Israel and all over the world, still the structure of the international system is anarchic. Anarchic not in the sense of disorder or war of all against all, not at all, but in the sense that states have to take care of their own national security. international bodies that supposedly should take care of security, of international security, are extremely weak, like the UN and even the UN Security Council that's in charge of this issue more specifically. There is no world government. And the issue is there is no security provider to all states. And that is a major difference between what's going on inside states, states that are well functioning, not failed state, obviously, and versus the international system. In the international system, there is no 911, like in the US, or 100 number that if people are in some distress, they can call, and supposedly, universally and automatically, some police force or other force should come and assist them. In the international system, we don't have an equivalent number and definitely not an equivalent force that will come automatically to protect every state that is, or any state that automatically is got this assistance when it is attacked. So when Ukraine is attacked by Russia, President Zelensky can find this number because it's not available anywhere. At the same time, the great powers, the more powerful actors in the international system, aspire to take care of their own security by having a sphere of influence. We'll then also discuss other motivation for a sphere of influence, but supposedly that sphere of influence should provide and take care of their own security by removing away the military forces of the rivals from their own borders. At the same time, the small states in the neighborhoods of great power must have great power allies. Otherwise, they are exposed to their powerful neighbor that establish or would like to establish this sphere of influence. And then these small states, if they are not protected by an external great power, they might be in a big problem. And that is the problem of Ukraine and NATO. NATO supposedly decided in 2008 to admit Ukraine, but without a timetable, without a timeline, without any procedures. It remained up in the air, and Ukraine is left alone to take care of its security in this anarchic system vis-a-vis its neighbor Russia. So that's about security. But security is not the only motivation of great powers. There is sometimes, and that's what's going on in the current international system, a situation of power transition. There is a change in distribution of power in the international system, and that affects the quest for status by emerging, rising great powers, or they are rising objectively, or at least in their own eyes. These periods of power transition are especially unstable periods, and they are prone for miscalculation. So even if, as we'll talk later, Putin has done here a major miscalculation, it's not only a question of personality and his isolation during the pandemic and so on, but the system, this system right now, as we'll analyze it, it's a power transition period, is prone to this kind of miscalculation. What's going on in the current system with the power transition? The change is from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. What is a unipolar world? Unipolar world is a world in which there is only one great power, or we can call it one superpower. And that was the situation until recently in the international system, with the United States being the sole superpower. There was no any countervailing coalition that could balance American power in the international system. But now, in the recent few years, we are in a certain process of moving to a multipolarity, namely having more great powers that at least some of them aim to balance American power. The key development is the rise of China, because China is a combination of economic, technological, and military power. So this is the key emerging rival of the United States. Russia, much weaker economically and have many problems, technological and numerous others, but the money that Russia has done from its energy sales, its key resource, didn't go so much to health and social welfare and other education, but to modernization of its military. So its military, at least on the paper, became extremely powerful. The other key development is the emergence of a China-Russia partnership of these two emerging powers. It's not an alliance. It's not a NATO alliance in which each partner is committed to come to the defense of the other when it's attacked, like in the NATO alliance. But still, it's a certain partnership, anti-Western, anti-American hegemony partnership, and not less important, anti-democracy partnership. At the same time, the United States is still extremely powerful in all power resources. There's no question about it, but it's in a relative decline, not so much because it's declining, but because the others are rising. And that wasn't the situation until a few years ago. But what not less important about the United States is after Iraq and Afghanistan and the disasters that happened in these two American major military interventions in the 21st century, there is a major public reluctance to go to wars. And on top of that, American society, American body politic became extrememily polarized. It culminated with the rise of President Trump, but still this polarization remained even in the post-Trump era. The rising powers usually, when there is a power transition international system, at least some of them become revisionist powers. Namely, they try their best to revise the international order. And one of their quests is the demand for sphere of influence, both because of security that we mentioned before, but also because of status. Supposedly, one of the signs that you are a great power is that you have a sphere of influence. Actually, the United States established sphere of influence already early 19th century with the Monroe Doctrine and establishing a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. So even the United States has this kind of sphere of influence. This sphere of influence is a sign of status because it supposedly signals a privilege of great power. It challenges one of the key values of the United Nations system, which calls for sovereign equality, that all the 193 states international system supposedly have sovereign equality, are equal in their sovereignty. But great powers, or at least some of them, aspire for this privilege that supposedly acquires them a special status and recognition as a great power. The third reason why a major war still erupts is the rise of nationalism. And here the expectation of liberals after World War II, and particularly after the end of the Cold War, that nationalism, and particularly ethnic nationalism, tribe, ethnic group, race, a religion, all of these attributes will be in a major decline. This expectation was not fulfilled. Even in the West, even in the bastion of liberalism, like the UK and the United States and other parts of Europe, but definitely beyond the West, and particularly in China and Russia, there has been in recent years major rise of ethnic nationalism. And one of the manifestations of this rise of ethnic nationalism is the willingness to resort to force, at least potentially, for national unification, namely to unify all what they define as their nation under a single political authority of their state. And also historical claims, supposedly the territories that belong to them in a certain golden age, whether it's objectively true or imagined a golden age, to claim these territories. The two key issues of these irredentist claims are obviously Ukraine, as we notice unfortunately for Ukraine, in the recent week, and the other key is Taiwan, with the Chinese claim towards Taiwan, which might be the next major crisis with even a greater implication, a worldwide implication than even the Ukraine crisis, which obviously is important for its own sake in a major ways. This national unification irredentist claims of emerging great powers like China and Russia challenge independence and national self-determination of states like Ukraine and Taiwan. In the case of Putin, it really culminated just in the eve of the invasion by claiming that actually there is no Ukrainian nation, that all the Ukrainians are actually Russians, and also their territory supposedly always belonged to Russia, whether it was the Tsarist Empire or the Soviet Union, supposedly it always was Russians. So that's the way it should be also in the future. At the very minimum kind of minimalist ethnic national claims of Putin and of his cohorts is for the eastern parts of Ukraine, the Donbass region, with its two provinces, because this eastern part are populated by Russian-speaking or by ethnic Russians, so supposedly there, kind of this national unification, ethnic national claims are stronger than in the rest of Ukraine. The fourth reason why a major war might emerge is the question of regime and ideology. After the end of the Cold War, we witnessed major expansion of democracy, and there were huge liberal expectations that democracy, like what Francis Fukuyama wrote, that's the end of history because there is no equivalent rival to democracy and to liberalism in its appeal to masses of people. But in recent years, there has been democracy backsliding in many parts of the world, even to some extent in the West itself, but definitely outside of the West. One key source of this backsliding, not the only source, but one important source is the anti-democracy struggle of the authoritarian. Why does authoritarian do it? Obviously, they dislike democracy, maybe ideologically, and they have all kinds of reasons. But one concrete reason of that, and that definitely applies to Putin, is the fear of the authoritarian that the spread of democracy in their own neighborhood will motivate their own public to demand democratization. Let's say if democracy succeeds in Ukraine, it becomes very appealing. And since Russia and Ukrainian, whatever, even there's two nations, but still culturally Slavic, some similarity. If it succeeds in Ukraine, maybe also the Russians would like to adopt the democratic model. And that obviously the greatest threat to Putin and to the oligarchs around him. Thus, their key goal of them is to suppress democracy nearby in their own neighborhood because it poses a major threat to their own regime, to their own rule, and to the huge benefit that they acquire from their rule. The final potential cause of a major war is domestic politics. We can assume that leaders above all want to stay in power, and they're willing to do a lot about it. One channel, one avenue to do it is the resort to so-called diversionary or scapegoat wars. What are these wars? These wars aim to divert the public's attention from domestic problems, from socioeconomic problems, from domestic instability, in order to consolidate the rule of this leader. And the idea behind these diversionary wars is this, the rallying around the flag, namely the idea that supposedly if your country, the country of this leader, is engaged in a war with a foreign country, then the public will stand behind the leader because the leader is fighting against foreigners. And since nationalism is based on this rejection of foreigners and definitely foreign rule, it might lead to widespread support of this leader. So leaders, maybe especially authoritarian, but sometimes even in a democracy to some extent, when they confront major problems domestically, they might be tempted to go to this kind of wars. Let's now apply, just a minute, apply these 5 reasons to the case of Putin and Ukraine and see what is a kind of specific motivation based actually on the ideas that we addressed thus far. The key motivation of Putin is to establish a sphere of influence, but a sphere of influence that will be much farther than Ukraine. Basically, to restore kind of the Cold War order of great power spheres of influence, particularly with regard to Europe, that Europe will be again divided between Western Europe, part of the West, and Eastern Europe under Russian control. Ukraine will be just the beginning of this establishment of a sphere of influence by Russia. So more specifically, if we go very quickly about the reasons, the causes that we mentioned for a potential war, apply to the Putin's potential motivations regarding the establishment of a sphere of influence, notably in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, because he also demanded from NATO and the United States to remove the military capability from all of Eastern Europe, all Eastern European states that joined NATO since 1999, since the end of the 20th century. Okay, so one reason is security. And the idea is to establish this security zone near the border and to end the eastward expansion of NATO, because supposedly in the Russian elite eyes, the deployment of adversary military, like the deployment of NATO forces, closer and closer to the Russian borders, produces a security threat, kind of a geostrategic threat to Russian security. This is maybe the only reason that enjoys much wider support that only Putin and his cohort, or the oligarchs and his clique, the former KGB officers and so on around him. Because supposedly it kind of takes care of national security, and the rejection even in many Western, in the West, that opposed the eastward expansion of NATO since the end of the Cold War, because supposedly in Russian eyes, it will pose a potential security threat. Whether it will be real or imagined, that's another question, but at least it might project this kind of a threat. But Putin and his leadership aims also to the status of a great power, namely that the West must recognize the privileges of Russia as a great power, and to distinguish Russia from just the small state that supposedly would like to enjoy sovereign equality, like Ukraine would like to enjoy national self-determination, independence, and so on. But in the eyes of Putin and his people, Russia should enjoy the privilege, and that can come at the expense of the sovereign equality of small states like Ukraine and other states in the sphere of influence that he would like to establish in the whole of Eastern Europe. Then we address also the national unification with co-ethnic and with territories that belong to Russia in a golden age, kind of the nationalist cause and source of the invasion, and all of the demands that go much more the invasion of Ukraine, but the demands to all of establish the Russian sphere of influence in all of Eastern Europe, and then the domestic politics. Russia, under his leadership in the first few years, enjoy economic growth and the situation improved and law and order and so on. But in recent years, there was growing economic problem and dissatisfaction sometimes from the Putin's regime. So the idea was to go in this diversionary war in order to divert the attention of the public from domestic problems. Whether it succeeded or not, that we have to talk about in the last part of the presentation. Then the ideological source of the war, to avoid the potential influence of a rival ideology, which might affect the powers, the powers on the public, the support of the Russian public in the Putin's government. And here is the Putin's fear of color revolutions leading to democracy. There were a number of color revolutions in the post-Soviet, in some post-Soviet republics after the end of the Cold War, aiming to reach democracy. And Putin became more and more fearful of these color revolutions because, as we mentioned, they might affect the Russian public itself to aspire for a democracy if democracy succeeds in the neighborhood. So definitely one key motivation for the war was to destroy Ukrainian democracy, as in the eyes of Putin and his guys, posing a major threat to their rule and to their benefit. So going very quickly about the underlying realpolitik context of the war is supposedly the balance of interest, the greater proximity of Ukraine to Russia than the United States, the fear and the threat in their eyes of NATO eastward expansion, and the key question of why now? Why now? Because in Putin's eyes, and is probably in his cohort, the image was that the world is changing, that there is this power transition. The United States is in decline, the West is polarized, the United States is unwilling to go to war, while China and Russia, the authoritarian powers, are rising, and that gives a great opportunity for Putin, supposedly, in his eyes, to go to war and to expand the sphere of influence of Russia, first to Ukraine, but later, if it succeeds, then much, much broader than Ukraine, and basically go back to the Cold War order of great power, sphere of influence at the expense of small states, freedom of choice, and even their territorial integrity. Okay, finally, let's try to address the potential effects of the Ukraine war. Will a new world order emerge in the aftermath of this awful war? And what I would like to present here is two potential scenarios about the post-Ukraine war world, the type of world that might emerge after the Ukraine war, based on the evidence, obviously very partial and very biased evidence that we can have thus far about these two potential directions. So on the left-hand side of the table, we have a kind of old world type of prediction for the nature of the international system.
You're not sharing the presentation, Benny. If you want to share, you have to, the new presentation is not shared.
Oh, so what, let me, okay. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it now. If you can,
okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so I hope the two former were okay.
Well, the first presentation we saw, the second one, actually, we just saw your face talking, which is okay. But now the third presentation is shared.
Okay. Okay, so the question that we are asking here in the third one, the second one basically applied the general causes that we mentioned, the first one to the case of Russia and Putin. So the third one asked the question, will the Ukraine war change the world? So we present here two potential scenarios. The left-hand side of the table presents kind of old world type of prediction of kind of world of power politics. And based on the type of past Soviet and Russian behavior and the absence of a substantial international response to their behavior in at least 8 cases that are mentioned here very briefly. During the Soviet period, the intervention in East Germany in 1953, in Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and then in Poland in 1981. And then we have 4 cases of actually Putin intervention with very mild, if at all, international response to it. And Chechnya at the end of the 20th century, Georgia in 2008, the intervention in Syria since 2015, and Crimea in 2014, and then later on in continuing in Eastern Ukraine. In all these interventions, what we have is actually military dominance determines political outcomes, and a very minimal, if at all, counter-international intervention. But if we move to the right hand side of the table, we might kind of expect a different type of world emerging out of the Ukraine war, potentially, and we should be very hesitant and very modest about it. A kind of a new world that will be different from the mild reaction to Soviet and then to Russian brutality in the 8 cases that I mentioned. This world might indicate kind of transformation in the nature of the international world. It would mean that Putin heavily miscalculated in resorting to force in this case. And actually, some of the lessons that emerging thus far, again, we should be extremely modest about it, but might serve as a potential deterrence of future invaders that will hesitate a lot before going in the footsteps of Putin and invading smaller countries. And that might indicate, even though the Ukraine war is awful and the humanitarian crisis is terrible, might bring about some potentially positive effect of the Ukraine war, despite the huge suffering of the Ukrainian people. So as opposed to this old world type of power politics, the military dominance determined political outcome, what we witnessed thus far in the war in Ukraine is popular resistance to the invasion, despite the supposedly major military superiority of the Russian military. And we also see international support, solidarity, and heavy sanction that might affect long-term outcomes, that might even result in growing opposition to Putin inside Russia. Obviously, we might be, before we go to the other cells, be a little bit cynical, because we mention and we highlight the international support, the sanction, the solidarity, the condemnation, and so that are almost universal. But obviously, from a power politics point of view, one element, and this is the only element that counts for the power politics, is missing. There's no foot on the ground. There's no military intervention on the ground trying to assist Ukraine. And from a power politics point of view, that's the only thing that matters. But we'll try to balance it with this type of new world expectation that maybe some of the processes that are taking place in Ukraine right now might challenge the power politics point of view. Again, the power politics is based on this anarchic self-help international system. The strong can attack weak state, and the condition that this weak state are non-aligned. While the international community, the so-called international community in the power politics view, doesn't intervene militarily, so it doesn't count really if it doesn't do this major step of military intervention. Still, we might balance it with the kind of a new world expectation that international support for the attacked country, even if it's limited to non-military intervention, might have some important effects. Even though small states still need protection, especially if they're located in the neighborhood of great power. And again, here the key question for the future is about Taiwan and whether the strategic ambiguity that the United States conducts its policy vis-a-vis China and Taiwan will deter a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Again, to the power politics, interstate war can happen even in Europe, but maybe we can conclude very modestly and very cautiously that based on evidence, again, very partial evidence that we have thus far, maybe interstate war can happen in Europe only outside NATO. And maybe NATO, at least, can deter a Russian invasion of the 31 members of NATO, which means the overwhelming majority of the European states. From power politics view, invasion occupation may still take place with minimal costs to the invader. But what the evidence from Ukraine show is that cost might increase quite a lot. High casualties to the invader, economic sanctions that might be very penalizing. And also, we shouldn't dismiss at all completely the reputation decline of Russia and the effects of the popular resistance, even if the Russian military succeed to occupy Ukraine. Supposedly, as we mentioned, from power politics point of view, sphere of influence provides security and status. But maybe the Ukraine war might show that actually the attempt to establish sphere of influence will provide insecurity because of the popular resistance. And actually, rather than high status, that the high great power status that Putin aspires to, it will actually generate a pariah status to Russia. And that, again, might deter potential invaders like China and potentially others in the future. As we mentioned, power transition usually generates instability. But maybe the recent major changes in the world, broadly defined, economically, culturally, technologically, internet, tourism, and so on, might have produced an interconnected world that, in addition to it, now the humanity faces common threats, like the pandemic that we all experienced in the recent 2 years, and climate change, and that might moderate the destabilizing effect of the power transition that we mentioned, supposedly that it usually destabilizes the world. What about regime and ideology? As we mentioned, powerful authoritarian aim to undermine democracy and to do their best to destabilize democracy and to undermine it. But I think what we have the evidence thus far, with all modesty, from the Ukraine war, is that democracies, even if they are relatively weak, stand up to authoritarian aggression, even though it's only Ukraine that fights, and obviously we have this qualification. But we can deduce from the evidence thus far that democracy is a major motivating force for people to fight and even be willing to sacrifice their life in order to preserve their freedom. So that shows some hidden power of democracy that maybe in the recent years with Trump and with the rise of populism and so on, we almost forgot about this power of democracy. We talked about diversionary wars, but maybe the Ukraine war would lead to the decline in the appeal of diversionary wars, especially if what it looks right now, casualties rise, economic costs increase, and all of that might lead to rising domestic opposition inside Russia. We already see, despite the authoritarian despotic regime of Putin, that people dare to go to the streets and to demonstrate despite the huge risks of demonstrating in Russia. And we might expect that the more economic sanction and the isolation of Russia will penalize the Russian people, they will show greater opposition and demonstrate greater opposition to the Putin's regime, and maybe even some of the oligarchs that benefited so much from the Putin's regime will try to affect or to remove Putin, the best case, or to change his policy because of the cost that they pay due to the kind of almost universal condemnation of the invasion. What about the West? Until the Ukraine war, it looks like the West is in decline, divided internally and inside the Western state and among Western states, with a growing pacifist inclination. Germany symbolizes it, obviously because of its special history, symbolizes this pacifist inclination most dramatically, while the United States, as we mentioned, kind of in a process of disengagement, definitely from Europe and the Middle East, while pivoting to Asia, but moving away from the rest of the world. What is the evidence we have thus far about the West after the eruption of the Ukraine war? Much more united than what we expected, both externally and internally. And we saw it yesterday with the State of the Union address of President Biden, almost bipartisan support, even though still we have Trump and his supporters that are great admirers of Putin and so on. But relatively speaking, after this huge polarization in the United States, we see some emergence of bipartisan support, at least for a harsh policy vis-a-vis Russia. We have to be modest about it, but at least some maybe modest change. And also we see in the West growing militarization. Again, the key case is Germany, and now willing to go to the 2% of its GDP to invest in defense. And that's a huge jump for Germany that always was very reluctant to go to major defense spending. We see the growing appeal of NATO. We now recognize to be a NATO member, you might be protected. And also the EU, even though it's economic and political organization, now willing to deliver military aid to Ukraine. So it's moving a little bit to the military domain that it was extremely reluctant thus far to move into. And maybe also the United States would be, as a result of this war, again, we have to be very cautious about it, but maybe more globally engaged, at least it was before the war. What about the rivals, the big rivals of the West, the authoritarian? What we did have before the eruption of the war is this China-Russia growing anti-democracy partnership. And obviously, because of the rise of these two powers and their sophisticated use also of cyberspace to try to divide and polarize the West, that pose a major threat to the future of democracy. But now, after the eruption of the war and what happened, what transpired thus far in the war, there are big questions whether the China-Russia semi-alliance, no, not a formal alliance, will indeed hold. And because of this, the penalizing economic sanction, we know that the Chinese economic rise is due largely to the economic interdependence with the West. So will China be willing to endanger this economic interdependence in order to maintain the alliance or the semi-alliance with Russia? That's a big question. We still don't know the answer, and that's a key question, maybe the key question for the future of international order, whether Russia and China will continue to go together or whether they will depart and China will move away from the partnership with Russia. Indeed, yesterday we saw that China abstained in the UN General Assembly and didn't vote with Russia against the resolution condemning Russia. Another key question always in international politics is the effect of hard power, especially material power, military power, and maybe also economic power versus soft power, the appeal, attraction of states. When we look in the short run, obviously hard power dominates. If we look in military battlefield, obviously the side with military superiority will dominate the outcome and will determine the outcome. But maybe also we speculate based on the evidence, even from this Ukraine war, is that soft power may increase cost in the longer term in some substantial ways. And soft power here means this pariah status of Russia, that the appeal of Russia to whatever it existed before the war now is in a major decline. And that indeed might affect even the Russian public. For example, the cultural boycott in addition, the tourist boycott, all these boycott in addition to the huge economic costs that might have substantial effect despite the military superiority over Ukraine that supposedly, according to hard power, prediction should determine the outcomes. What about the balance of power versus the balance of motivation? In a kind of old world terms, obviously the balance of power dominates, unless the power itself decides that it's not important enough, the intervention for it's like the United States about Vietnam or the United States about Afghanistan or Iraq and so on. But otherwise, we should expect the balance of power will determine outcome. But actually what we see in the Ukraine war thus far is that despite Ukraine being much weaker from the balance of power perspective than Russia, we see how the balance of motivation that favors Ukraine in some major ways, because the Ukrainians fight both for their national homeland as well as for the freedom related to democracy. So, and while the Russian soldiers don't look very highly motivated to go and fight and die in this useless war from their perspective. So we see here that the balance of motivation might limit the effect of the balance of power, despite obviously the huge effect of the Russian material superiority in the balance of power. With regard to international institutions, the UN powerless, and thus far we can't say there is much change. Indeed, there was an overwhelming majority in the UN General Assembly yesterday against Russia, and that might have some symbolic effect. We couldn't dismiss it completely, but the real world effects of that are limited unless they are joined by all this economic, cultural, pariah status that we mentioned that a large part of the international community are now joining. A key norm that supposedly should maintain international peace is the territorial integrity norm, namely that states must respect the borders of their neighbors, of other states. What we saw before the Ukraine war, that Russia violated this norm in some major ways. In 2014, it annexed Crimea, even though it was part of sovereign Ukraine, part of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And then just in the eve of the war, the Russian parliament recognized supposedly, quote unquote, the independence of Donbass, this Eastern Ukraine province. And if this annexation, or supposedly supposed independent, but it's really annexation to Russia, will hold in a future political settlement, because we know that already there are political negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. And if this annexation, de facto annexation of parts of Ukraine will hold, that will be a major violation of this important international norm. It will jeopardize international peace. But on the other end, if the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine will hold in a future political settlement, that will be a major victory for international norms and for consolidating international peace in the future. But what about the humanitarian crisis? It obviously is awful. And already before this humanitarian crisis, we already see what Russia has done in Syria, for example, with its massive bombing that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in our neighbor, in the Israel neighbor to the northeast in Syria, and also a flow of refugees to Europe that brought about the rise of populism in Europe and instability and so on. But now, even though there is also ongoing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and refugees, as opposed to the kind of low-level condemnation of what happened in Syria, we see a almost universal condemnation. We see the heavy sanction and the isolation of Putin that we completely didn't see in the case of Syria, even though in Syria, hundreds of thousands of people were massacred by Putin airplanes. But now, at least the attitude of the world is completely different than what was the case just a few years ago. Nationalism, we talked about this wars of national unification, but the counterforce to it, and might be the case in Ukraine right now, is we see kind of emerging civic nationalism, namely nationalism that based on the citizenship of all the people in Ukraine, and that leads to powerful resistance to these Russian attempts to follow the logic of ethnic nationalism and to try to take away from Ukraine the parts that are populated by Russian-speaking people. So, for example, one indicator of the civic nationalism is that the president of Ukraine is Jewish. And we kind of remember the kind of former history of Ukraine that was much more ethnic nationalist, while now maybe kind of as an emerging civic nationalism that is much more inclusive and gives a lot of power for powerful resistance to the occupation and invasion of Russia. Finally, nuclear weapons. That's obviously an extremely important issue with potentially huge implication for world peace, and we don't have to elaborate it because it's clear-cut. What we saw, unfortunately, in recent days is a very dangerous resort to nuclear alert by President Putin and rhetoric on the use of nuclear weapons. And that might lead in the aftermath of the war to a potential nuclear arms race, and maybe states that feel that their security is endangered to try to acquire nuclear weapons. And that might affect also the nuclear deal with Iran, for example, and might affect other cases of state maybe aspiring for nuclear weapon in order to deter future invasion. And that might be a very risky and dangerous process. What we might hope, even though it's still a kind of a hope, that the taboo that was established after the nuclear revolution against the use of nuclear weapons will hold. And we cannot forget that in 1994, Ukraine conceded its potential nuclear capability. Maybe it was already in the stage of weapon, but anyway, the potential of a nuclear weapon, it conceded in exchange for promise by Russia, pledged by Russia and the Western powers to maintain its independence and territorial integrity. So the fear is that this lesson of Ukraine conceding its nuclear weapons might unfortunately motivate other states to go to a nuclear, to try to acquire nuclear weapons because of this unreliability of international accords. So finally, we can conclude that the Ukraine war will definitely have major implications for international order, much more than the previous cases of Syria and Chechnya and the previous Soviet interventions and Crimea and the intervention in Eastern Ukraine. But here we have a turning point, but it's still, the question is up in the air, whether we'll continue and maybe accelerate kind of a power politics world in which military power dominates political outcomes. And here, obviously, the great worry is that the West, okay, fully support Ukraine, but is unwilling, obviously, to go to war and to protect Ukraine. But the other kind of more optimistic scenario, despite the huge disaster, humanitarian disaster in Ukraine, is maybe the combination of a powerful popular resistance of the Ukrainian people motivated by civic nationalism and by democracy, and the universal condemnation and also going to considerable sanction against Russia will make our world a little bit maybe, and maybe more than a little bit, more peaceful and more collaborative, trying to face the common threats to humanity like pandemics and climate change, rather than engaging with all these ethno-national struggles and great powers rivalries. But at this stage, we can basically mainly hope, even though it's based on some concrete evidence, but obviously we have also the counter, more pessimistic evidence that we have to weigh about what the future international order will hold. Thank you very much for listening to the talk, and I would be happy now to address questions.
Thank you, Benny. If you have a question, feel free to open your mic and ask, or send it in the chat. I think we have a bunch of shy people, but Benny, thank you so much. It was really a thorough analysis of the situation, very well presented. Wanted to thank you on behalf of the Mirage Institute, and a copy of this, a recording of this Mirage Talk will be available on the Mirage Talk website.
Thank you very much, Eli, and thanks the audience very much. And if you can send me, please, the recording, that will be
absolutely
highly appreciated.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, the audience, very much as well.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה, היה מעניין מאוד.
תודה. תודה.
תודה רבה.
תודה.